welcome to Series 3 of Autism in Conversation with Auticon, a podcast from Auticon, a global IT consultancy whose consultants are all autistic. This series is designed to help raise greater understanding and appreciation of autism through fascinating conversations with inspirational guests. Hosted by me, Carrie Grant, each episode will feature fantastic guests from all walks of life who share a passion for making the world more inclusive. We'll be talking about the many benefits of hiring neurodivergent talent through to some of the more common challenges faced by autistic adults navigating the workplace, plus much, much more. All of my 4 children are neurodivergent, yay! So this is a subject very close to my heart. I'm really looking forward to facilitating some great conversations about autism and hopefully learning some new things along the way. I hope you enjoy it too. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Autism in Conversation with Auticon. In this episode, we'll be looking specifically at autism diagnosis in women. This is a really interesting one and something that has come to the fore over the last few months, with several high-profile women speaking in the media about their own late diagnosis. These stories are just the tip of the iceberg and show that more conversations need to be had about what it means to be an autistic woman. From the way autism presents in women compared with men, to the diagnostic process, through to how autism affects women in their daily lives. There are a great many issues that need further discussion so we can pave the way for improvements in the future. Today, I'm joined by a panel of guests who all have their own unique experiences and perspectives to share. They are Helen Ellis, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Coordinator at the National Autistic Society, Carrie Jones MBE, British Autism Advocate, and also Rachel Rowe, CEO and founder of Autism Camp Australia. Thank you so much for being with me today. I'm so excited. You are 3 of my heroes. All at once, here, together. I love it. So I guess the first thing I wanted to start with is, let's go to Carlie first. What were your first signs? What were your first indicators? When did you first start to think, hang on a minute, everyone seems to be this way and I'm slightly different to that? When was that?
Well, without using the word autism with it, I would say probably about 3 or 4. I would really notice the differences when I was going to preschool. Now, I can say this with some certainty, not only from, feedback from my mother, but I also have my short-term memory's bad, but I have a photographic memory from about 1984, and I was born in 1982, so I can, which I also thought was normal, and apparently it's not. Honestly, I'm terrible. I remind people of something they said 10 years ago and hold them to account. But anyway, so I can remember going into preschool and not being able to go, and my mum having to go, and then getting a job at preschool, then at school, and at secondary school she didn't go, and I kind of fell apart. But I wasn't diagnosed until 32, after 2 of my 3 girls were diagnosed as being autistic. And because there wasn't that much out there, kind of 2007-ish on Google, about girls, everything was kind of male orientated. I found some bits, and what I read, I was like, that's it. Now I've got a name for it. I know why I was so vulnerable and why things were so different. So I, in hindsight, probably knew from 1985, yes. but to give that a name, probably
it's really interesting, Carlie, because just straight in there we get this word normal, don't we? I knew that when I went to school that wasn't normal. And because we have, I always say that normal is an ideology. It's just something we've created and said that's what normal is. But when you are different to that particular thing, right? Yeah. And what about for you, Helen? What age were you when you started to notice, hang on a minute, what's going on here?
I think I was about 15 when my mum started to notice. I didn't really know at that point because everything was quite different in my life anyway. People made a lot of excuses for me. So they put behaviour issues down to the divorce, to moving home, moving schools.
Trauma is a really can have similar outcomes, can't it, in terms of behaviour and reactions.
And I think there was probably a time when I was around 12, it should have been picked up. But at that point of your life, everyone blames hormones.
Of course they do.
So it took a little bit longer until we started to get into real sort of exam stress that I think people started to pick up on the fact that this wasn't entirely the same as what everyone else was going through.
Yeah. I always hate it, and the way you just said about the teenage thing. I have it said to me well, all teenagers are a bit bonkers. You're like, just please, honestly, this is not just normal level teenage stuff. Come on, guys. And for you, Rachel, what age were you, and when did you start noticing, hang on, I'm a little bit different to perhaps like my friends around me?
Yeah, it wasn't really a pivotal moment, but I guess there was just a general sense from me of feeling like I was on the outside looking in, very much the black sheep of the family. I never quite fitted and didn't really know how to find a place in the world, really. I think people made it look so easy, effortless. And I don't know, how did they know what to say, how to act? I was really operating on this false premise that everyone saw the world like I did, but of course now we know that that's not the case. So being me didn't really make much sense, really. I couldn't rationalise the intensity of my emotions or my deep observations of others, my awkwardness socially, needing structure, repetitive routines. These were all make sense now, but then these were just sort of, things that I was a little bit broken or a little bit too sensitive or a little bit too this or a little bit too that, So, my mind was always going at a gazillion miles an hour, and my disappointment, I think, at the sort of realities of life, the shortcomings of others and myself were, that emotional regulation stuff was there and so strong, and my real inability to I guess to accept the imperfections of the world, a feeling that has constantly driven me, really, to strive to improve upon it. And my drive, that ADHD, I'm an autistic ADHDer, so that drive, my ability to design and build a house or grow a business, or I was never satisfied, always on this sort of striving for what I call the eternal quest for knowledge, I think. And I just put it down to, having grown up in the UK 22 years ago, I left the UK, but I just put it down to my father's strong British work ethic. But now I know that, of course, my father was also autistic, and we were just having very obsessive special interests, So yeah, it was complicated, and I think just lots of negativity and negative feedback in my world that really I just became par for the course. Yeah, and I didn't diagnose till I was 48, only 2 years ago.
2 years ago. Oh my gosh. Well, let's just park there for a moment. Can we talk about that? Because that kind of late diagnosis, and there are so many women, certainly in the UK, this is a really big age bracket for diagnosis for women. What happens at that age? Is there a sense of regret or grief that you've missed all those years not knowing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a combination of things, really. On one hand, I remember I had already sort of connected into an adult autistic community, online autistic community, and one of the most moving things for me was being welcomed home by that literally welcomed home by that autistic community when I had my formal diagnosis. So it's a mixture. It's a relief. For the first time in 48 years, I felt validated, vulnerable, but validated. And you start to look back over your life and make sense of everything, to reassess situations, conversations, misunderstandings. But more than anything, I think it was a celebration, It's okay. It's not just okay, it's more than okay. It all makes sense now. And I'm, really happy to be in this place with my uniquely quirky autistic brain. But I think the most beautiful part of it all for me is that my autistic daughter, Quincy, will not have to carry this aloneness that I felt growing up now, because not only has she been diagnosed, but I'm with her now. We're in this together. And I think for our generation, we didn't have autistic adult role models, and I love the fact that in all these parents coming to late diagnosis, and then some of the younger generation coming through. We were talking off air before about Chloe Hayden, one of our amazing teen role models here in Australia, and how impactful their work is. It's extraordinary that difference is going to make for our children having those autistic adult role models, rather than just this real aloneness that I felt. Yeah,
I really hear that. Being able to see yourself is so important. Otherwise, it's difficult to show up as yourself if you think, I've never seen one of me. you know, you need to have that, don't you?
We run camps for autistic children and their families, and I was sat in the office at one of the camps one day, and this little girl who had particularly taken a shine to me came and sat with me, and we were chatting away, and I turned around to her and I said, Taylor, you realise I'm autistic, don't you? And her jaw just a bit about hit the ground, and I went, come here, let me take you. And I took her out to the door of the office and I went, and Tamara's autistic, and Laura's autistic, and Sarah's autistic. And that was such a pivotal, powerful moment for me, in seeing really strong, powerful role models for the first time, really. Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to over-gender our autism community, because I think that also happens. But it has been said that female autistic people can be more sociable, and that sociability can also mean that they are in mainstream school and sometimes not seeing people like themselves. I know we run a support group, and one of the things I delight to look at is when all the little girls turn up and they all hang out together. And for most of them, I would say, you know, if we've got 20 girls in the room, 18 of them, it's the first time they've ever met another autistic girl, because they're in mainstream. And actually, there probably are autistic children in their class, to be frank, but they don't know it. And I think that it's being seen, showing up as yourself, knowing that actually you're not alone. You're not on the outside looking in. You're on the inside. It might be a slightly different space, but you're on the inside of that space. And Carly, I just want to talk about the diagnostic process, getting to the point of an assessment. Is that something you found easy? Because you were diagnosed a few years ago now, and I'm imagining it was even more difficult then than it is now.
Yeah, so I was diagnosed at 32 and I'm 40 now, hence the grey hairs. It was a challenge. I had to go to my GP, and then I had to go through the mental health route. They thought I had a social anxiety disorder. I was medicated, which made me feel like a zombie. I don't have a social anxiety disorder. I'm just socially anxious because I'm autistic. We're always looking at the petals, the symptoms, and not looking at the roots. And the root cause of my social anxiety, previous eating disorders, XYZ, was autism. And then I wasn't diagnosed, Carrie. I wasn't diagnosed at 27 because when I went to the clinician, they said, what are your hobbies? And I said, I love acting. And they said, well, you can't, and this is going to wind Carrie up, I can see. They said, well, you can't be autistic if you like acting, because you wouldn't be able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And I said, well, I don't. I allow that person to be me for a while, which I've been told by some of my kind of Emmy Award actor-winning friends that actually we go to drama school for 8 years to learn that, you know.
To learn what you do naturally, 100%.
So I continued with my advocacy with my mum hat on. And it was actually at the National Autistic Society conference. I stood up on stage in front of about 400 different doctors, clinicians from all over the world up in Harrogate. And in the front of the row of that was a lady called Judy, who I'd been speaking to all day. Judy kept offering me a cup of tea, and I thought, Judy is the nicest volunteer I've ever met. It was... And then Judy invited me to dinner, and I thought, this is nice. And it was a really posh dinner, and I wasn't dressed to be posh. And Judy gave me a business card and said, you might be wanting this. And it said, Dr. Judith Gould. And I said, do you know Dr. Judith Gould? And she said, no, I am Dr. Judith Gould. I had to go outside. I don't smoke anymore, but I had to go outside and have a cigarette. I didn't know what to do. I'd spent all day, Dr. Judith Gould, she'd been offering me cups of tea. So I was quickly diagnosed.
She's one of the she's like the leading doctor in terms of female diagnosis. I'm sort of slightly, as you're saying it, Carly, I'm wondering, because she kind of has sidled alongside me like that, and I still haven't even had an assessment. So every time I do this podcast, I'm like, okay, I need to do this. That's it. By the end of today, that's it. I'll have signed up for it, and then I won't do anything about it again.
It's the Judy Gould tap on the shoulder.
Yes.
She can smell us.
I've had one of those. Oh, Carly, I love that. That's such a good story. And for you, you know, maybe people are listening and they want to know what's an autism assessment like? What do they say? What do they involve?
So
what was yours?
So I went for an assessment, or actually I'll get told off if I call it an assessment, because there's a difference between assessment and a diagnosis. So the diagnostic tool is the one that I had was disco. So I thinking I'm going to have to put some sequins on. Is this a party? It's not. Yes. That'd be quite a good diagnostic tool, though, wouldn't it? Shove us all in a party, see if we cope.
Great.
But it's not a precise acronym, but it's called the disco. And instead of it being kind of quite a rigid tick list of yes or no, do you like dates? Oh, do we mean like numbers, as in dates of history? Do we mean, those sweet things your granny eats at Christmas? Do we mean, fish and chips with your crush at the seaside? But, not rigid. It takes hours, actually. And you go into, if you're going through the National Autistic Society, their centre in Bromley or in Essex. And it's a semi-structured interview. So it's lots of questions, and it really gets the context and the 360 of that person's life experience. So if you were to say to someone, how many friends have you got? And they said, oh, well, on Facebook I've got this, and on Instagram I've got that. Oh, I've got 4,800 friends. They might go, oh, well, you're very popular. But actually they'll say, OK, after that, the last time you were unwell, who came to visit you? Because that's a true friend, isn't it? If you're poorly, your friend's got to turn up, unless it's COVID. If your friend's got to turn up and see if you're okay. So you can really build up a picture of that person's life experience rather than what they might be presenting to the world or masking to the world, because we mask in our diagnostic room, definitely. So we need someone that knows about masking and how to see behind the veneer.
Yeah, and also you mentioned there... you alluded to empathy, and there has always been this terrible trope that autistic people don't have empathy, which is insane, absolutely insane, because many autistic people, they're feeling the room the whole time. In fact, it's over sensitivity in terms of being able to pick up on what's going on around them. That's my experience anyway.
Yeah, I think sometimes the stereotypes of autism, and again, not trying to gender it too much, because I know it's incredibly fluid, but sometimes it might be, oh yes, an autistic person likes to, take a computer apart and put it back together. Actually, a lot of autistic women and men, they're social fabric fixers. We fix differently with the foster parents, the psychologists, the vets, the nurses, the volunteers, the advocates. We're fixing, but we're trying to fix the social fabric as opposed to something technical, perhaps. But there's also lots of great autistic women in tech, but there's lots of ways to fix things.
Yes. I love this word, social fabric. I'm writing that down. And for you, Helen, you were a little bit younger when you got diagnosed. You were in your 20s, weren't you? And what was that like? Was your mum kind of leading the way at that point? Or by that age, were you doing stuff yourself in terms of... Because like with health, quite often it's still our parents, even in our early 20s.
So I was at university at the time, so I sort of set off the referral process. But my mum was involved in the actual diagnosis day. Yeah. She was asked to come along to the appointment. We talked a lot about my childhood at that point, and she had to step in and give some of the actual answers for me, because I'd got a little bit traumatised by remembering some of the really bad memories, and I sort of retreated into my own head a little bit. So she had to sort of step forward and give some of the examples of when I was really young around sort of socialising. I was always good at making friends. It was keeping them that was my problem. Yeah. So my mum was constantly seeing this turnover. There's always new friends she's being introduced to. And she was the one in the assessment that actually sort of turned to me at one point and said, Helen, don't give the answer you want to give, not the one you think you should give.
Yes.
And it was that moment kind of going, oh, OK, so I've actually just got to let that little voice in my head take over and talk for once, rather than kind of shutting it up and putting a filter on top of it.
Yeah. But often we have those filters because we're taught, I can't remember which one of you that said it, we're too much, or the too this and too that. So, of course, the mask is encouraged, even though the mask isn't really it helps in some ways. It helps you to be bilingual, I guess. But it doesn't help when you can't show up as yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. It helps other people feel like they are not responsible for your pain and struggles, but it doesn't actually help you.
Ouch. Yes, I'm hearing that. I'm really hearing that. And for you, Rachel, were you surprised by your diagnosis?
No, I mean, I think, so the combination of, my daughter was diagnosed about 18 months, 2 years before me. And I guess in doing the reading to support her and learning this new language, suddenly all the dots started to join together of my own neurology, really. And then the hundreds of hours of research spent developing our charity here and talking to family after family and parent after parent, understanding autism in its many different presentations. It wasn't long before I saw the writing on the wall, so to speak, and self-diagnosed. And then it was about a 6-month wait for me to privately seek a formal diagnosis with Dr. Tony Atwood, who you'd be familiar with, who's based very close to me. So it wasn't a surprise. I think the complicated bit for us was trying to work out what was going on for Quincy, and then when we worked that out, then it made a lot of sense, and it just sort of built from there, really. And then like I say, it was just it was like mostly celebration from that point, really. I mean, there were some friends lost, there were many new neurodivergent friends gained over the last few years. I think my heart breaks for the little girl and the young adult who was so misunderstood, and there's some regret for me around that, to not find out who you are and that you're actually an awesome autistic ADHD rather than a broken non-autistic is good. But I wish I'd known I wasn't broken, 38 years before that or 48 years before that. Yeah.
You guys are amazing. I'm inwardly saying, ouch, ouch, all the way through this, just because that is the story for so many autistic women on the outside, not feeling like that, not knowing how to get in, even knocking on the door, going, please let me in, how do I get in? And then realising, actually, you're wonderfully, beautifully, incredibly autistic. And that we don't have that impression always of autism. Let's move on a little bit. As well as your own direct personal experiences, you also have a much broader understanding of some of the issues facing autistic women through your working lives. So I'd like us to now spend a little bit of time exploring that. Statistics show that those assigned male at birth are more likely to be diagnosed as autistic than those assigned female. Why do you think this is the case? Let's go to Helen first on that.
I think a large part of it is around what society expects to see from the genders. There's still a lot of stereotypes, even outside of autism, about what you expect little girls to do, what you expect from little boys. And so when a teacher in a school, when a paediatrician, when someone out on the street sees a little boy struggling and having a meltdown, they see aggression, they see a problem to be dealt with. When a little girl is struggling, they might just see someone who's very emotional, who doesn't want to comply, essentially. So there's that judgment right from the very beginning about how we should be as people. And then when you start to sort of bring autism into the conversation, people go back to the stereotypes that they know that are very outdated now and we need to move on from, but are still there in a lot of people's minds. And it just causes those problems.
Yeah, I absolutely hear that. And for you, Carly, a lot of your work has been advocating for women.
Yeah.
Why do the boys get all the look in? What's happening there?
Well, I think, remember we spoke previously and I was just saying that, we often think of things as being... if it's autistic, a kind of that Rain Man approach, it must be techie or it must be, numbers, maths. And we're not thinking about those kind of social fabric fixers. And I just think generally it has been historically more so as well that more men are doing those jobs or hobbies than women. And then they go, oh, that can't be autism then because that looks really different. And the acting bit, you kind of think, I know many, many, many actors who are autistic, whether officially diagnosed or have come up to me and gone, oh yeah, me too. And that's because you've got a script. You know what to say, you know what to wear, what you're going to say, what the other person's going to say. If you get it wrong, someone yells cuts, So all of those kind of things, but very broad.
You get to have another go.
Yeah. Real life doesn't give you a second
nice
chance.
about that.
They just judge you. But I think very broadly, it's taught me as well, not only kind of the male versus female, which in itself is a challenge. There was some research done, and I can't remember if it's Switzerland or Sweden, but I've referenced it in my book. They did some. So they were saying autistic women naturally have more testosterone than non-autistic men, and autistic men naturally have more estrogen than non-autistic women. So actually, how do we define gender? Really, it's more gender stereotypes and social construction, and autistic people aren't as socially constructed. So our genders are going to be very fluid anyway, I think. But that's probably another discussion for another time. But a diagnosis, I found, is a huge privilege, particularly if you're female. And if you can't afford a private diagnosis, we need to really respect kind of self-identifying autistic people as well, and race, sexuality, gender, all of it it's a huge thing. But women historically have been overlooked. In my 30s, Carrie, I would say stand up and say, "Oh yes, this is clinical misogyny." I'm a bit more chilled now. I'm in my 40s, so I'll say it's clinical misunderstandings and perhaps lack of experience with girls. But as Helen speaks a lot about masking, kind of a masking expert. But if you have a young child come home from school and they don't want to go outside and play football or mess around, they want to go and read Matilda 5 times. If it's a little girl, you're going to think, "Oh yes, how studious! What a lovely young lady." If it's a boy, you've got to go, "What's wrong?"
Yes.
So,
yes.
Social construction. Yes.
Yeah. And we know also, obviously, it's not just about male, female, even though that's what this particular podcast is about. We also have the fact that black and brown people are not included in some of the studies.
Yep.
And so therefore, if the studies that are then going to set up the diagnostic tools...
Yeah.
It's how those diagnostic tools are set up, who they're set up for and by. And if it's always like the white cis man doing the testing, and therefore all the kind of the tools end up in that same way. So that makes it very difficult, particularly if you're intersectional. You know, if you're black and you're autistic and a woman, then those things are going to be more problematic to show up. And also, this is me just banging my own little drum here, but also the fact that so many of our black and brown people are sent down a social, emotional, mental health pathway because they are deemed to have behavioural issues rather than an SEN pathway, a special educational needs pathway at school. So that's to do with just the teacher's opinion. And I think that's another thing that impacts going for an assessment, because obviously, we've spoken about it here even for two of you. Well, my child was autistic, and when I started looking at what was happening with them, I began to realise, actually, maybe that's the same for me. So that's something that you're relying on the school to tell you. So a lot of this is not just about our health systems, it's about our education systems, understanding what to look for when you're looking, at a child who is displaying behaviours that are not the same as the other kids. What's going on there? Asking those deeper questions and not just kind of parent blaming or judging because that's your impression of what girls should be like or what black children should be like or brown children. Now, I'm always thinking, Rachel, that Australia is ahead of us in terms, mainly because they stole Tony Attwood. I'm only joking. But, you guys have got some great doctors out there, haven't you, who have really championed women and autism. What is the situation out there now? Are more women being diagnosed, or is it still very male heavy?
I think there's definitely a shift happening. I mean, it's really interesting watching what's happening, particularly between the US and the UK and Australia. I mean, there are a number of my contemporaries, I would say, a number of our organisations that are all autistic-led, excuse me, all coming from a place of lived experience, and we are obviously all working to the social model of disability. So we're really, it feels like there's a really powerful groundswell here. I mean, I think the issue is that ensuring that shift or move from the medical model of disability to social model of disability makes it from the head office and the state or federal policies to the front line in schools and organisations, and that people really start to understand the correlation between triggers and behaviours. We got to de-shackle our little auties from all of those neuronormative expectations that we have to wrangle every day of our lives, and create safe spaces for our autistic community. And if we're in a safe space, we don't need to teach social skills, we don't need to manage behaviours. But I mean, I think just talking about race and gender and all of those intersectionals, I mean, there's very little research done at all within our Indigenous community here in terms of autism. We're actually looking at putting some funding into that area. I've worked in the Indigenous sector previously, and keen to see the growth of understanding in those in Indigenous communities really happening. There's very, very little either support or understanding for our Indigenous communities around neurodivergent diagnosis at the moment, and so there's a lot of work to do there. But I mean, that sort of basically speaks across the board to many things that are just not happening on that level with our Indigenous communities, with our lost generations. But I think I think some of the key areas that we really got to look at in terms of problems with our autistic girls and women is really, there's this sort of misnomer that if your child's protected by the absence of a diagnosis, but ultimately the labels other people are going to give them to explain their differences are going to create far more damage than if that child is actually, seeing themselves as a successful autistic person. I think we all know the stats around life expectancy are pretty horrific. It's mostly to do with filicide and suicide. And, for autistic women, those stats are 13. I think autistic women are 13 times more likely to die by suicide than non-autistic women, compared to 7 times for men. So it just goes to show, and sexual violence, we're vulnerable, I think, and I think that's my biggest concern for my daughter coming through, is her vulnerability in that space. So I think there's a bit of work there to do to really educate around what's actually going on for autistic young women, girls, and us as adults, and try and redress the balance there.
Rachel, it's really interesting. You've said so much there that I'm in utter agreement with. I think sometimes we can think we've really moved on and done really well, and more girls are getting diagnosed, and isn't it great? But you've just listed so many things that I'm like, oh my gosh, and there's that, and there's that, and there's that. And these are all areas that need looking at. So in our final little section here, I wanted to ask what you really want for the future. Carly, let's go to you first. What are the biggest changes that you would like to see made to improve things for autistic women and girls?
I believe policy and laws are there to protect us. I think any type of legal system, any type of policy, any type of board should have an autistic person, preferably an autistic female, because we're very organised and we're never late, on board as kind of that filtration system. That should be, it should be a law itself that there's at least one autistic woman on every board, every panel, every judiciary system. That's really important. I really want, so people can get a diagnosis. So that's kind of my worldview hope, my blue sky thinking, which will take decades, but we'll get there. I want autistic girls that have been abused, survivors of abuse, to be able to still get their autism diagnosis, because a lot of the time, what I've seen over the last 14 years with my hat on supporting other people and other organisations is, they've suffered abuse, it must be an attachment disorder, it must be trauma. In which case I always say, well, were they displaying autistic traits before the trauma? Because if so, it wasn't the trauma. And that's incredibly important, because the frustration, what I'm seeing over and over again, is that the most vulnerable autistic girls aren't getting their diagnosis because of their vulnerability. We know 91% of autistic people have endured some form of abuse prior to diagnosis, support and self-awareness. I was at NHS Tayside up at Dundee just Friday gone, and that kind of 91% came from this very informal survey monkey type research I did in 2014 before I went to the UN. And a lady stood up in Scotland who I'd never met before, working with Women's Aid and those sort of arenas up there, and said, "Did you know 9 in 10 of our of the people that come to our Women's Aid for support are autistic?" And I was like, "It's the same stats. It's the same stats." So and if you think that we kind of believe that, only 1% of the population is autistic, why are 9 out of 10 women going to Women's Aid in Scotland autistic?
Oh my gosh,
so I really hope that clinicians, when they're looking at an autistic woman, don't go, oh, there's trauma there. And it's the same for the local authority, local authority care children. A lot of those won't get diagnosed because they're worried that they're making a wrong diagnosis because they've had some sort of trauma or neglect or abuse in their life. So my hope is that we can kind of throw that out the window, actually, because it's not oil and water.
My goodness, Carly, those are really quite scary stats.
Yeah.
Helen, your work is so vast as an author, working at the National Autistic Society as well, and on all your work on inclusion as well. What would be, I guess there's probably 100 things you'd like to see change. So if you were to narrow it down, what would be like, if we could look at the small steps over the next few years, what would you like to see happening?
I think there's kind of a two-pronged approach. One is society in general. We need to be better at getting rid of our bias and stereotypes. You mentioned about race earlier, but we're also talking classism has a huge influence. We're talking about understanding different religious and cultural upbringing can have a huge impact. So we need to, as a society, get better at realising how individual people can be, and that difference isn't bad. Difference is just different.
Yeah.
But from the autism perspective, we need more of those positive role models. We need a wider range of role models, people that have lived lots of different life experiences. And we need to start making people feel safe, because that's the key thing. It's what Carly talks about with vulnerabilities, but it's also just that safety to be able to stand up and say, well, this is my identity and I don't care who knows it. I don't have to stop and think, are you a trusted person to tell I'm autistic, to make myself vulnerable by giving that bit of information over? It should be something that we don't have to think about. It is just part of who we are, and it is perfectly natural to mention in conversation, to ask for help when we need it, to pipe up with a bit of information when we know it and no one else does.
Yeah.
It is just who we are, and we are happy about it.
Yeah. I long to see a day where I'm more than happy with the label autistic. I think it's a wonderful label. But I long for the day where the labels are almost, it's there, but you wouldn't have to go, hello, I'm Helen, and by the way, I'm autistic, just in case you need, that we just kind of meet and we kind of go, oh yeah, I know who you are. That you get that, because as a community, we understand that, right? We all meet people, right, that have no idea that they're on the spectrum, but you're like, well, I'm not diagnosing you here. I'm not saying that, although I do inwardly. But just that we kind of understand. We're like, okay, I get you, and I'd love for the neurotypical people to have that skill to just kind of go, okay, all right, I understand this person in front of me might need these little adjustments. Let me just tread carefully and work out what they need without them having to do a big declaration. I hate the fact that my kids have to go everywhere and go, hello, my name is blah, 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 and I'm autistic. It's great that they have the confidence to do that, and the autonomy and the advocacy and all those skills is wonderful. But I long for the day where people just get it. Come on, can we just get it? Please?
We're in a world where I don't have to walk up to someone and say, oh, by the way, I'm short, so I might need help getting stuff off the top shelf.
My husband doesn't have to go, hello, I'm David, I'm black. I think people know that. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And for you, Rachel, what would you like to see change? I'm thinking about your diagnosis being 2 years ago. You've got Quincy, you've jumped into a whole community here, right? So what would you like to see change?
Look, I think what we've recognised both through the work we're doing with the charity and also just through my own personal experience is that social connection is, social connection's such a powerful predictor of long-term physical and mental health, and having meaningful friendships or lacking them has an impact on so many different parts of our being. So, we know that people with strong social connections survive longer on average than those with poor connections. So for me, at the heart of everything is autistic community. And for us and the work that we do here, it is absolutely a stepping stone to mainstream social and community participation, and without that stepping stone, it's really hard to make that jump. So I really want to see more energy put into creating autistic community. I think if we can create that, then we can really work towards true inclusion. It's not about segregating us, it's about creating that safe space. Again, Helen was talking about it. If you create the safe space, that's where the magic happens, and that's where we can really encourage growth. That's where we can really build capacity and confidence and celebrate neurodiversity and embrace difference and nurture individuality and build confidence and redress, some of that negativity that we've all grown up with, and develop all those friendships and that really strong, positive sense of autistic identity. Yeah.
Wow, you guys are so inspiring. I'm feeling like Beyonce this morning. Like, who runs the world? Autistic girls. Who runs the world? Yeah. I feel like autistic women, girls and women, are so good. And like Carly says, turn up on time and get things done. Like, we should just be left in charge, really, right?
I hear.
Sort it all out. I jest. Okay, I've so many takeaways from this. I think we've moved forward. We've seen that there has been progress. We've seen that more girls are getting diagnoses, which is really helpful. We've seen that people are somewhat more aware of what it means to be autistic, but there is still a very, very long way to go, particularly in our institutions. Like, if we need to get policy change, we are going to need for those people to have a sense of what life is like for autistic girls and women. I think in the education system, we've still got a little way to go with people being really informed. Parents are getting a little bit more informed, I would say, because they chat in the playground and they get to see each other and talk about their kids. The main thing I was thinking about is something that Rachel said at the beginning, which is just standing on the outside looking in. That really hurts me. That hurts me to the core. And that I would love to see change. No more standing on the outside. Being able to show up as yourself, be allowed in, be allowed your part in the game. And I think but more of the older women being diagnosed, I think, is going to lead to change being made. If you look at what you've done, Rachel, just in the last few years, your diagnosis is 2 years ago. You've got an autistic child, and look at all the things that you're doing. When I look at what Carly does in all of her work, she's never stopped. She's always talking about it somewhere. And both of you, and authors, you're writing books and stuff. So there's plenty of ways of accessing the stuff that you're talking about, which is so very important. Thank you so much to Helen Ellis, Carrie Jones MBE, and Rachel Rowe. It's lovely having you with me today.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. We really hope you enjoyed this episode of Autism in Conversation with Auticon. If you'd like to know more about the podcast, would be interested in applying for a job as an Auticon consultant, or would like further information about how Auticon can help support your business, please visit auticon.co.uk. This episode was recorded in September 2022. Recording and production was at Strathmore Studios in Clerkenwell, London. It was engineered and edited by Billy Godfrey, and music was by The Lethargies. That's all from us this time. Thanks again for listening, and bye for now.